Okay, we are having some audio problems, mostly with monitoring it. We cannot hear what we're sending, and so we're doing a little quick test here to see if our volume is good for you because we're unable to hear it somehow in our system, in our tech situation here. So we're not hearing a monitor, so it's we're blind, or I guess it would be deaf. We are deaf right now on our end, and so we're trying to find out if you can hear us and what volume setting we need to set it at. And then we'll be able to get started right away as soon as we get our volume set. Last session was very low volume. We had the same difficulty. We went ahead and streamed without it, basically deaf, that we couldn't hear what you were hearing. And so we're trying to get a good sound for you this time before we begin streaming. So that's the delay tonight, this morning, wherever, whichever it is for you. And we'll try to get that resolved here with this audio check. So if any of you have any input, if you're hearing this, okay, if you'd let us know. And we have our someone else here that is on the stream hearing it. So hopefully we'll be able to tell whether we're getting good sound or not. So we're going to get another sound volume check. We're going about as high as some of our things allow. Can you hear me now? How's that? All right, we're getting a thumbs up from our listener. Do we have everyone else that's anyone else out there that can confirm good hearing, good audio? Anyone out there? Do we have any other ones on that stream? Is this just Facebook or we got them on all of them? Okay. I have to wait 10 seconds for you to respond. Okay. Why aren't you answering me? All right. If our volume levels sound good, we're going to go ahead and start our stream here in just a couple of minutes. Do you want to turn off and then come back in? Or you just want me to go? You want to bring it? Are you on to YouTube and Periscope? Better? Okay. Oh, we don't mind peeking at red. That'll wake people up. All right. So we're on Periscope and we're on YouTube. Everyone's streaming. All right, very good. Well, let's get started. This session. This is session 12. This is a bonus session because I essentially finished my material and I offered to address any issues or questions that you had that you didn't feel were adequately addressed or that I just simply didn't cover. There's no way in a uh, 11 session overview of eschatology that I can handle every prophetic passage, and I understood that. And so I just wanted to address these that you specifically wanted. A couple of the questions I already addressed last session. It was in that material, and so we're not going to pursue those. But I have the whiteboard behind me rather than graphics so that I can go through some of these and bring forward some things. So the first passage that we're going to deal with is a question regarding Daniel chapter 3. And this, just to get you up to speed very quickly, is the interpretation of Nebuchadnezzar's dream uh, of the great statue. It starts with the head of gold and it goes right down to the feet and toes. And so we're going to pick up, the question has to do with the very last aspect of that statue, of that vision. And appropriately, we should ask a lot of questions about this because this is the representation of the empires that brings it to us. the way we know it brings it to us because it's the last kingdom, the kingdom that Christ will overthrow. And that is described for us at the end of the passage beyond what we're studying in this question. So I'm going to read a portion, about 5, 6 verses, and then get into the exact question that was asked. And so this is Daniel chapter 2, beginning verse 40. It says, "And the fourth kingdom shall be as strong as iron, inasmuch as iron breaks in pieces and shatters everything. And like iron that crushes, that kingdom will break in pieces and crush all the others. Whereas you saw the feet and toes, partly of potter's clay and partly of iron, the kingdom shall be divided, yet the strength of the iron shall be in it, just as you saw the iron mixed with ceramic clay. And as the toes of the feet were partly of iron and partly of clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly fragile. And as you saw iron mixed with ceramic clay, they will mingle with the seed of men, but they will not adhere to one another, just as iron does not mix with clay. And in the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed, and the kingdom shall not be left to other people. It shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever." And we're going to end right there. And the question is revolving around verse 43 in a specific phrase, and that phrase is a is probably one of the more difficult phrases in this entire passage that there's a lot of disagreement on. There's a lot of ideas out there about, and so it's appropriate that this question is asked. And that comes to this concept that somehow the iron, which we understand as being associated with the Roman Empire, that there is fairly strong agreement. I'm not going to say 100% because that's not true, I think, of any passage of Scripture. There's pretty strong agreement among a majority, overwhelmingly, that that is referring to the Roman Empire. But when we get to that idea of them being mixed, and that's in the feet, is the emphasis is more on the iron, and is still dominant, but there is some clay. By the time we get to the toes, it's the clay that has a greater portion and the iron a lesser portion. So we have, as we talked about in one of our earliest sessions, we have this deterioration of the Roman Empire. We don't find a revived Roman Empire, we have a deteriorated Roman Empire. And Daniel's communicating to us that deterioration in verse 43 by saying that they, and we're going to talk about defining they, will mingle, and that's another word we want to understand, with the seed of men. And that is the phrase that is so troublesome for us. And so I want to address this by looking at 3 words, particularly the they. Who does the they refer to? What does it mean to mingle, and what is the word for men used here? Because this, I think, will unlock it. We'll have to change our perspective on something a little bit to help us really do that, of some of the traditional models of what we think of when we think of empires. And so when we come to this, again, this phrase, many people want to go to Genesis chapter 6 and the idea of the sons of God seeing the daughters of men, and that's in play here, that there's a demonic element, and there's some revivalist of that, Nephilim and things like that. And I would really discourage that line of thinking. It really isn't portrayed here, and that's not really what we're talking about. Others have gone into Jeremiah and other usages of this concept of the mingling of the seed of men and the mixing of Israel with the Gentiles in terms of intermarriage. And they see this, and this is a very, probably one of the more common mainstream approaches, is to see this as the intermarriage of some foreigners in with the Roman, pure Roman race. And I don't know if there ever was a pure Roman race, frankly, because of their engagement with Greece, with many other nations, and that they conquered. I don't know that that is a concept that can be rightly imposed here, and certainly not all the way down to our age. Most of those that talk about intermarriage are doing it in the period of the Caesars, And that's really not in view here. What's in view here is something much later. Has to be, because we find the the final kingdom that Jesus Christ himself will destroy. And so, how are we to handle this? Well, we're going to look at three words. As I said, we're going to look at the word mingle. We're going to look at the they. Who is the they? And we're going to look at the concept of men. And here's the order we're going to deal with this. I'm going to start with the word mingle, not the word they. And so we have that they are mingle. So what is the concept of being mingled? And there are three root Hebrew words here that we could be attached to, not that to this word, but to the concept of mixing and mingling. There's three choices, and if you go to your Strong's Concordance, this particular use of the word mingle is tied in with the first of the three. And I'm not going to really cover the other ones extensively. I really want to talk about this word. And one of the words that Strong's uses that I think is an important one is the concept literally of to braid. To braid is what that word talks about. So I got a D on here. So when we understand a braid, we see that it is not an intermingling like you would have in a marriage situation. It is not that here we have the seed of one kind of man and the seed of another kind of man, but rather that would be intertwined to the point of being indistinguishable as separate, but rather that the iron stays iron and the clay stays clay, but they are braided together. And there are other words that are used there in that root in Strong's, and I really encourage you, if you want to look into those, to consider them. But it also uses the term to meddle with. That is meddle, to meddle, or to just mess around with, to kind of interfere with it. That's another concept in this part of the word. Um, and then the last idea that comes out in this Hebrew word is actually tied, of all things, to the financial environment, and it's really kind of to stake claim to, and it's tied into the concept of a mortgage, that you're going to financially stake claim to something that you have a legal uh, liability there. And so we're going to say to. I believe in the Strongs, they use the word mortgage or loan, things like that. And so it's the idea of making a claim against something, that you are staking claim to something that is not yours, but you now are taking a role where could lead to your ownership of it. So why are these concepts different? Because intermarriage is really not presented by this. The other root words in the Hebrew would have relayed that a little bit more, and there are other completely different words that are used to relay that idea. And so I really don't uh, hold to the position that this is referring to intermarriage between different people groups. And so let's talk about the word men. And the word men here is actually the the word that is almost identical. It's same root word of fragile. And so the word here, men, is not your typical Hebrew word for men. It's really a word that, if you want to talk about it, it's a lower class. In fact, I'm going to use the word that men are the commoners. So we're take, when we begin to understand that the seed of men are the progeny, the generations of commoners. And this is something that is pretty foreign to us now, the idea behind that. Uh, but in biblical times, and really even up until just recently, in the last few hundred years, there was a clear understanding that there are two classes, particularly. There's a ruling class and a class to be ruled, commoners. And what this term talks about, and the word used for the word men here, are the common class. So here's the common class that does not have claim to the ruling class, that are going to be intermingled. They're going to stake claim, though they're commoners, to the ruling class. Now, we don't think of ruling classes, but this is not only a societal norm, this is a biblical concept where God comes in and says, I will establish the kings. I will decide what clan, what family, what tribe kings come out of. I will decide that for Israel. In fact, he says, I will decide that for all people. And historically, all through history until just this very end of history, we have always had the idea in every society that the ruling class was established by divine right, a divine right to rule, either by strength, by blood, by whatever. And so there was always this connection to a divine right. We see that even in Israel. You had to have a divine right. And thus it was the prophets that came and anointed the king so that he had divine right. Even in the separation of Judah and Israel during Rehoboam, there was still that God is going to select, and God selected Jeroboam to rebel and by prophetic utterance to rebel against Rehoboam. And throughout the history of men, there has always been an understanding that they're the ruling ones have divine authority to rule. And that is true even into the Roman Empire. We talk about the Roman Empire as a comparable to us. We talk about the Senate, but we don't. What we often think of them is that they were a democratic republic, but they weren't. They were a republic. The senators were not elected; they were selected among the ruling class throughout the Roman Empire. And so while they had a republic, it was not a democratic republic. And so it wasn't just whoever was the most popular. But now we have, in the deteriorated form of the Roman government, in the Roman style of empiredom, there's a new word for you. We have the commoners coming in and staking claim to ruling. That is, that no longer do we recognize the divine right to rule. Now we have commoners claiming the right to rule, and we have this interbreeding of the principles of the Roman Empire with the claim, the mortgage, if you will, to the commoners who are staking claim to ruling, though they have no divine right to rule. And this is not by marriage. That I don't find that in the verbiage at all, although many commentators have declared that. And so we have that they are interfering with the ruling class by staking a claim to it. And this is the commoners. And this is when we look around our world today, this is essentially impacting every country. Almost every country is impacted this way. And again, this has been an experiment that really has only been going on for 250 years, 300 years, really going back into the period where the authority of kings were being challenged, not only in England, but in France and other places. And we have the claim of commoners, common men, they didn't have divine right to rule to that ruling class. And this brings us to the last word we want to talk about, and that is the they. They, that I would contend, is the ruling class, the true kingdom. And when we talk about the true kingdom, we see in verse 44, the reason I want to read verse 44, it says, "And in the days of these kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom." So these 10 toes are 10 kings who have some authority. They have, whether they are of the clay or of the iron, we're going to struggle to identify that. But we have that there's a ruling class that has a divine right to rule. We have the commoners coming in saying, we're going to stake claim to that. We are going to braid ourselves in. We are going to interfere. We're going to meddle in this rulership now. And I believe what you have described here in the very end is what we're seeing geopolitically in our world that we feel is the proper way to rule now, and that is by the election of the masses. So now we have democratic republics cropping up all over the place. And that this is the iron with clay, and it's just fragile. And that fragility is being more and more evidenced today. It is rife with problems. And even the founding fathers of the United States knew that. They said this system will not work if we have anything less than a Christian populace, because you're intermingling divine right to rule and you're giving it to commoners. And and where is the divine now? Where does God come in? How does God select your king? Where are the prophets? Where's the godly element, the divine element in the selection of your leadership? Now we are ruled not by a pure ruling class that is divinely gifted or given that, but the commoners not only can become rulers, but we are interfering and we are saying we're going to decide whether you have the right to rule. And I really see that that is what is being depicted here. I know that is radically different than anything else you're going to see out there. So I really challenge you to study that out and look at these words and consider them. But I don't see the other explanations for this passage holding any water. And what I also am intrigued by is how many of them say, well, we don't really know what it means. And well, we know what the words say, but because we look at a kingdom and we think of people instead of principles, the principle of rule, and the rule of the iron of Rome was in its form of government. There were other elements of Rome that gave Rome such a power to endure for so long. Even to this day, their influence is unmistakable in government after government, particularly of the West, but now it has penetrated even throughout the whole earth. And so we're looking at 10 kings, but they have been mingled with the seed of men, with commoners. They have been interfered with, and so they're fragile. They have some strength in them. There's some strength in a republican form of rule, but there's weakness when it's dependent upon not God, but the mob, the majority, that the majority can decide these things. And that simply isn't a biblical model that is anywhere presented except perhaps right here. So that's our first one there in this category. All right, so that's in Daniel chapter 3. Now we're going to jump to a much longer one, request, and this is going to take us to Matthew. And again, if you have any questions on that, on Daniel chapter 2:43, please feel free to write there. I do read your comments. I do answer them when you give me specific questions, and I want to do that. Uh, the, the desire, the request was that I do an overview of the Olivet Discourse from start to finish. I have made connections between Revelation and the Olivet Discourse occasionally throughout the 11 sessions. And the request was that I would just go through it in order. So let me erase this behind me. And we'll do that. So the question, and we have three chapters, three versions of the Olivet Discourse available to us. That's nice. So we have these three things. Most people talk about Matthew 24. Most of the work being done is on that. I'm gonna at one point I'm gonna direct you to a different one to help us in some of our understanding of the Olivet Discourse because I think it does a better job in that respect and to help us especially as Westerners. So we have here a private conversation. Uh, the disciples are coming to Jesus. Jesus has said something in public that has piqued their interest. And that statement is that as they walk through the temple and they're commenting on the wonder and the beauty and majesty of it, Jesus Christ made the statement that not one stone will remain upon another and they'll all be thrown down. And the disciples thought about that for a while and they asked him in private, we are told, to explain that. And they ask him a couple of questions. And depending upon who you talk to, whether it's two or three questions, they're listed here for us in Matthew 24, verse 3. And the reason we use the Matthew passage primarily is because we have the the greatest amount of information here. And so the question is formulated this way. Now, as he sat on the Mount of Olives, hence the Olivet Discourse, discourse is just a conversation with the disciples. The disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" So we have really three questions. The first one is, when will these things be, which would certainly refer to the destruction of the temple. And then the question is, what will be the sign of your coming? And that is portrayed in Mark and Luke as what is the sign of these things coming? That is, how can we anticipate them? But here in Matthew, Matthew develops that and says, what is the sign of your coming? They associated the destruction of the temple with the coming of Jesus Christ. And then the third question is, and what is the sign of the end of the age? So we have three categories that the disciples want information about. I don't know that in their minds they were three distinct events. In their mind, they were likely thinking they were all just a single event. That certainly, if this cataclysm happened, then this would certainly happen, and this would certainly happen. And I'm not sure that they understood what it meant to be the end of the age either, because I don't know that they understood the church age yet. And so Jesus Christ is going to go into a very powerful and instructive conversation with them to lay this out. Now, the first thing he's going to do, he's not going to really answer their question with positive statements, but with statements of the negative. In other words, I'm going to tell you what's not the evidence. And that's very important to the position that I take, that these things are not the evidence of the end. These things are evidence of continuation. These things are the evidence of time. And so we find that, first of all, Jesus says, don't let anyone deceive you. And we are immediately confronted with the fact that there's going to be lots of different ideas. There's going to be lots of people presenting themselves as false Christs. Many will come in my name saying, I'm the Christ, are going to deceive me. So there's going to be deception. There's going to be wars and rumors of wars in verse 6. See that you're not troubled. All these things must come to pass. And then at the end of that verse, as I shared in an earlier session, but the end is not yet. So Jesus is saying, I understand your question, but the first way to answer your question is to make sure you understand what you are going to experience and that it is not the end. So I'm first telling you what you're going to see in your life and in the period, the age of your ministry, and even the entire church's ministry that is not evidence of the end. And so Jesus Christ is starting off with the negative. Here's what is not the end. And so wars and rumors of wars, not the end. False Christ deceiving many, not the end. Nation rise against nation in verse 7, kingdom against kingdom, famines, pestilence, earthquakes. Verse 8, these are the beginning of sorrows. This is not the end. These are just the beginning elements. And so and then it says, then they will deliver you up to tribulation, kill you, and will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. Then many will be offended, betray one another. And so we have this progressive tribulation. Remember, tribulation is not the work of God against sinful men. It is the work of sinful men against God's people. And so tribulation is the outpouring of men's hate against the truth, Jesus Christ, not the outpouring of God's wrath. And so tribulation is going to come. It's going to be directed at the disciples and at the followers of Jesus Christ. We're going to have more false prophets, and lawlessness will abound, it says, and love of many will grow old. And now finally in verse 13, we start getting close to what we're looking for. But he who endures to the end shall be saved. So now we're still talking about salvation, and there's endurance. And we're not at the end, but he who endures to the end. So everything we've talked about, everything Jesus Christ has communicated so far, is not the end. Here's what's not the end of the age. He's actually starting with the last question first, but he's doing it in the negative. These things are not the end. You see these things? Don't concern yourself with my second coming. Don't concern yourself with the end of the age. Don't concern yourself with that. These things are not the end. And then a very important phrase in verse 14. Which also gives a lot of weight to the idea that we're talking about an extended period of time. It says, and this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world as a witness to all the nations, and then the end will come. Certainly that didn't happen at Pentecost. Certainly that didn't happen by the end of the first century of the church. That certainly had not happened. Jesus Christ's statement here is that all the world will hear the gospel, the kingdom of God preached, and it will be witnessed to all the nations. And so the end cannot come until that happens. Well, when is the age of the preaching of the gospel? What is the church age? So this entire period is describing things of when in other words, the tribulation is happening while the gospel is being preached, while there's wars and rumors of wars, while there's famines, pestilence, and earthquakes in various places, while there's many deceivers and false Christs. So all of that happens in one period. And it is the negation of their last question. What is the sign of the end of the age? Well, I'm going to tell you what's not the sign, because that's what most of you are going to experience, not the signs. These are the signs of the continuation of this age. Endure it. And we're going to see a lot of those words later on. Now he's going to back in and handle a different question. He's going to jump to their first question. You might say, why is he doing them out of order? Because Matthew, Jesus, and Mark are all Israelites. And they're not really concerned about the chronology. They're concerned about themes. Remember that? All the prophets of Israel, that the Hebrew approach to this is not chronologically concerned. That's not the priority. The priority is different. And so we're going to come to this. We're going to see it described. And so now he's jumping to the first question, but it also has some relevance to the last question. It says, therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, and then there's a parenthetical phrase that's very important that most people skip over. Whoever reads, I'm sorry, let me get my glasses. Whoever reads, let him understand. Let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let those who are on the housetop not go down, take anything out of this house. Let him who is in the field not go back to get his clothes, but woe to those who are pregnant, to those who are nursing babies in those days. Pray that your flight may not be in winter on the Sabbath, for then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been since the beginning of the world until this time, nor ever shall be. And again, he describes that unless those days were shortened, no flesh would be saved, but for the elect's sake, those days will be shortened. Then, if anyone says to you, and we're going to stop right there before I get into that. So now we're talking about the abomination of desolation that Daniel talks about. This is the desecration of the temple. This we know happened in 70 AD. He is describing some of the things that happened up to that, he gives them instruction that when you see this happening, you should be out of there. You should be up in the mountains. You should be hiding. You shouldn't be trying to collect all your gear and rent a U-Haul and get all your stuff and move. None of that. You just go with whatever is in your hands and on your back. Run, because there's not going to be a lot of time. And we talked about that being comparable to the description in Revelation chapter 12, that this is referring to the fall of Jerusalem, and particularly to a period in 67 when the siege of Jerusalem began under Cestius's command before Titus showed up, and Cestius just marched away. And so we have this concept that Jerusalem is surrounded by armies. There's going to be a siege, but there's going to be a very brief opportunity to escape. And that brief opportunity, Israel's going to lay hold of. The Israel of God, the remnant, the Jerusalem church is going to lay hold of and excavate themselves from that area and run. And rightly so. Jesus Christ communicates this to them, and they do that. Now, there is this parenthetical phrase that I want to talk about very briefly. Whoever reads, let him understand, is a statement for us to be alert, that there's some huge significance going on here. Obviously, this had already happened. This had already happened in Israel's history. It happened under Antiochus Epiphanes, who came in and claimed to be God, set himself up in the temple, desecrated the temple there, and it's the purification of that the Jews celebrate Hanukkah. And so we find the purification necessary. So this had already really happened, and for most people, they would have not looked to Daniel and the abomination of desolation as something to answer the questions that were asked about Jesus' coming, when the temple's going to be destroyed, and the end of the age. That didn't really come into their radar, really. But now Jesus is saying, well, that was one instance. Here's another instance. And the evidence is, and notice the term, let the reader. The reader. Isn't that interesting? Let whoever reads, let him understand. And that idea, it means that Jesus is talking to someone other than the disciples he's talking to. He doesn't say you people should listen. They're the listeners. They're not reading this. They're hearing it. Who's reading it? Who's going to read this statement of Jesus Christ? Who's going to read these instructions? Well, it's going to be another generation of Israel. And certainly some of the Gospels were written by 67, and we could certainly give some weight to that. But in terms of wide readership among Israel, its availability would have been limited. And so we're looking for another fulfillment of that, and we see that at the midpoint of the 7 years of Daniel's 70th week, which Daniel communicates that happens in the middle of Daniel's 70th week, and we saw that in Daniel. And so we know that there is two historical events that's already transpired, and we also know that there's a future one that awaits Israel for the Temple Mount. So we have, again, he's gone back, answered the first question, but it was related to the second question. The third question. He still hasn't answered the second question. Hasn't addressed it at all yet, really. They're still asking for signs and for when is this going to happen? When is the destruction of the temple? And then verse 21, he comes in, there will be great tribulation, such as not been since the beginning of the world until this time nor ever shall be. And unless those days were shortened, no flesh would be saved. And you might say, well, is that talking about the fall of Jerusalem? I don't think so. We're going to talk about why by looking at someone who is more interested in the Western idea of chronology. And so let's go to Luke. So why do I think we're transitioning now away from that and we're talking about different days? And because, again, the Israeli authors and speaker weren't that caught up in chronology, but Luke is our friend because he's not an Israelite. He doesn't come from that background. And so he has a different perspective on this, and he is concerned a little bit about chronology, about doing things in that orderly manner. And so I want you to turn to Luke chapter 21, and he adds a little phrase here that will at the at the end of the fall of Jerusalem. He begins the fall of Jerusalem, verse 20, and it's very similar that we see. Let's pick up. Oh, let's just read verse 20. But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, he doesn't talk about the abomination of desolation because he's not writing to Israelis. So he's writing to Theophilus, who is a Roman, more than likely, perhaps a Greek, but a Roman. And so he doesn't talk about the abomination of desolation. He talks about the siege on Jerusalem. So you see him surrounded by armies, then know its desolation is near. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let those who are in the midst of her depart, and let not those who are in the country enter her. Get away from Jerusalem if you can. Same fundamental message. For these are the days of vengeance, that all things which are written may be fulfilled. But woe to those who are pregnant. Very similar phrase, the stress on the land. Verse 24, and they will fall by the edge of the sword and be led away captive into all nations. And then this last phrase is very important. And Jerusalem will be trampled by the Gentiles. And here's your time gap. Until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. Until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. Now we go to Revelation chapter 11, verses 1 and 2, when John is told to measure the Temple Mount. Remember that he's not allowed to measure outer courtyards because that is still given over to the Gentiles. The times of the Gentiles aren't even over at the midpoint of at the first half of Daniel's 70th week. Even that temple built then is still built during the time of the Gentiles. That brings us to the conclusion of the time of the Gentiles. It means that we have a gap here. We have a gap between the fall of Jerusalem until we get to the tribulation period that, or not tribulation period, but the period that is talked about in Matthew 24 as being a very horrific time. And again, we're going to see the delineation coming out in verse 30 of Matthew 24 that communicates perfectly with verse 25 of Luke 21. But we don't have the intervening information. Matthew is going to give us the intervening information. Luke does not. That's why we usually use Matthew, because it has more content there. So let's look at it. What's going to, in this intermediate time, what's things going to be like? It says the days, and I'm going to say those days are not the days of the fall of Jerusalem, the sack of Jerusalem, but of the days of the Gentiles were shortened. No flesh will be saved. But for the elect's sake, those days will be shortened. Then if anyone says to you, look, there he is the Christ, or there, do not believe it, for false Christs, false prophets will rise, show great signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even the elect. And this we tied to Revelation 13, that there are going to be great signs and wonders. One of the things of the final representation of the nations, the second beast, which is the eighth head of the first beast, performs signs and wonders. The signs and wonders are not fake. They're real. But their purpose is to deceive us into following after them instead of God. And that's going to be a very potent thing. Believe us, believe our science, believe our technology. You don't believe your old Bible. Don't deceive even the elect, even if possible the elect. The chosen ones of God are going to be trusting more in the science and tech of the world than in God himself, and trusting his word. And so I see that played out a lot in many scientific arenas. And that's going. So signs and wonders are going to be shown, and their purpose is to deceive us, to tell us lies, to help us follow after them. But the signs and wonders themselves are not fake. They're real. They are accomplished. And we saw some of those listed in Revelation 13, including fire being brought down from heaven in the sight of men, which we have seen in our lifetime, pictures that talk. These are miracles. These are you take them for granted, but any other age of men would consider them overwhelming. And he says, uh, I've told you this ahead of time, verse 26. Therefore, if they say to you, look, he's in the desert, don't go out. Look, he's in the inner rooms, don't believe it. For his light comes from the east and flashes to the west. Also, the coming of the Son of Man be. For wherever the carcass is there, the eagles will gather together. Now he's finally going to address the second question. And he's still giving us the times of the Gentiles, that time is going to be cut short for our benefit because it's going to get very bad. There's going to be great tribulation. There's going to be enormous amount of martyrdom in the days, weeks, months preceding the Daniel 70th week, preceding the rapture of the church. And we need to be prepared and braced for that with an expectation that, remember, God told those seated around his throne to wait for the last martyr. That's what we're waiting for, is the last martyr. And the evidence is there's going to be a lot of them at the very end of the age of the Gentiles. And so we come to this, and they're saying there's going to be a lot of people. They're going to say, this is the coming of Christ. This is the coming of Christ. This is the coming of Christ. Does that sound familiar? That's been going on all my life. All my life I've been hearing people saying, run out to the desert, run into the jungle, run over to there. This is going to be go up to this mountaintop. It's going to be the coming of Christ. And Jesus says, you don't have to do that. It's going to be like the lightning across the sky. That is not going to be regional. It's going to be throughout the whole earth. And it's going to be unexpected. And it's going to be seen by all men. It's not hidden. It's not regional or local. And it's not something that most will be expecting at all. In fact, maybe one of the things that is going to keep people from expecting is all the false claims, all the false alarms. The Christ is coming on this date in this place, and that's going to just wear down people's interest in it and think, oh, these are all charlatans. And so immediately it says in verse 29, after the tribulation of those days. What are those days? It's not those days of the fall of Jerusalem. It's those days that Luke brings out for us, the times of the Gentiles, the days of the Gentiles, where they will have it all the way up into Daniel's 70th week. Immediately in that tribulation of those days of that we're living in, these are the days of the tribulation. This is not the 7 years of the outpouring of God's wrath. Tribulation is not that ever that I can see in Scripture. And so verse 29, immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light. The stars will fall from heaven and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. He will send his angels with great sound of a trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. And so we have this description that is identical in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and in the description of the sixth seal in Revelation 6. And so this all correlates. And so we have this enormous event occurring at the conclusion of the times of the Gentiles, the church age, the day of great tribulation. There will be this event that is the rapture of the church, where the angels are sent out. There's a great sound of a trumpet. He gathers the elect from the winds. He is in the clouds. There's no secret rapture. Everyone sees this. And in Revelation, it says that men's hearts will fail them. They'll hide. This is repeated by Luke and described there. And so we have this event, and that event is the coming of Christ. So the answer to the disciples' question, what will be the sign of the coming of Christ? Now remember, the first question was, when will Jerusalem be destroyed? And so he gives that answer second. The third question, when is the end of the age? He gives that answer first in the negation. But he does answer the second question: what is the sign of the coming of the Son of Man? And that sign is, first of all, a great martyrdom. There'll be a great tribulation of the nations against the people of God. And not just one nation, but all the nations will be against them. They will be the most hunted people on the earth. And that will be one of the signs of the coming of the Son of Man. And the next sign is a very quick one. I don't think there's a mistake using the imagery of lightning. And that is that we will have the sun and the moon darkened, the stars fall from heaven, and the powers of heaven shaken, and then we'll see Christ. So the major sign that we're going to see is not this uh, what we've witnessed, and it's been severe, but not to the severity that Jesus talks about in those days, in the end days of the times of the Gentiles. The severity of the persecution will just become extraordinary to such a degree that Jesus Christ has to get back here to preserve any to participate in the rapture. And that is the particular sign that I hear no one hardly talking about. Are there signs of Israel? Yes, certainly. And we have seen them. Are there signs, other signs among the nations? Yes, we talked about those with regard to the United States and Great Britain and the technology and the talking. We talked about all those. Those are there. But if you want to know what is the most immediate sign, what are the things that tell you I better catch my breath because I'm ready to go? And this is what it is. This is what Jesus answers. He says, "Listen, there's going to be great deception. There's going to there are going to be people saying go here, go there, and there's going to be an intense time of persecution that Jesus Christ has to cut short our time here to preserve us." And so, and then if you want to know the immediate sign right before his coming, it will be the darkening of the sun and the moon and the stars falling up from heaven, which is the sixth seal being broken open. So we will witness those things, and it will give us a little bit of time. And the example that Jesus Christ is going to use here in Matthew 24 to help us prepare, and because in verse 36 and following, we're still in the Olivet Discourse. And also the parable of the fig tree tells us this too. He says, listen, I've told you this so that you can be prepared. You're not going to know the day or the hour, but you can know that it's on the doorstep. It's right in front of you. And here's the description he gives to us. Let's jump down to verse 42. It says, watch therefore, for you do not know what hour your Lord is coming, but you know this, that if the master of the house had known what hour the thief would come, he would have watched and not allowed his house to be broken into. Therefore, you also be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect. And so at an unexpected hour, Jesus Christ comes. How can we be ready? How are we going to be expectant? How are we going to know? We should know something. And that there is going to be this deterioration. We don't know the exact hour, but we know that the time is drawing shorter and shorter and shorter. And so notice what you're supposed to do. Set a watch. If you know a thief is coming, you set a watch. Now, does that tell you the thief has come? Does it even tell you if he's a stealthy thief? It might be able to tell you he's approaching, but you cannot arrest someone for just approaching your house. To become a thief, he has to break and enter. And so when you hear the glass break, you know that now the thief is here, but you're already prepared because you've set a watch, you've seen where he's come in, all those things. And so when I look at the signs, I categorize them. There are those that show it's approaching, and then there's one that shows it's happening. There's the glass breaking. And the glass breaking, that you actually have a thief at work that are breaking and entering, is the sun, moon, and the stars. That cataclysmic event described in the sixth seal. The approaching thief is identified by all these other signs that we have talked about and looked at and are exciting to say, that's already here. That's already here. The day of the Lord is approaching for sure. Is it right now? No, because I'm in a building without any windows right now, so I can't tell you if the sun, moon, stars are are going dark. But that is the immediate time, and I think there'll be just a lot of people think I'll just be doing my normal things, and suddenly I'm gone. That I don't see that in Scripture. I see that they're going to see these cataclysmic events and know this is what the glass is broken, the the Lord has come, and I should be looking. And now I can look to the heavens. Now I'm ready to look for Jesus in the sky. I don't walk around when the sun is at full strength looking for Jesus in the clouds. I'm waiting for the sun to darken, the moon to darken, the stars to fall from heaven. Then I will be saying, then I'm going to put down whatever I'm doing and I'm going to look and say, I'm looking for Jesus because it's next. That's next, immediately next. And so this is the description. These are given to us to recognize the day and the hour. So this is Christ's extended answer to the disciples' question. Again, not in the order they asked them, but that's pretty typical. But Luke does give us that helpful information to set our time, our chronology by. And again, Luke, in a briefer presentation, again tells us in Luke chapter 21, uh, if you pick up in verse 34, but take heed to yourselves lest your hearts be weighed down with carousing, drunkenness, and cares of this life, that the day come on you unexpectedly. The main way that we're going to be unprepared is we're going to be too worldly to notice. We're not watching it approach because we're too enamored by the pleasures of this world. For it will come as a snare on all those who dwell on the face of the whole earth. Notice the extent of it in verse 35. Verse 36, watch therefore and pray always that you may be counted worthy to escape all these things that will come to pass and to stand before the Son of Man. Please notice the word escape. There is an escape. All these things, all the horrible things that are coming upon men from God, not necessarily escaping the tribulation that's coming from men against the church, but to escape the wrath of the Lamb that's to come following these indicators for us. And so we are told to watch, to pray, to take heed, to stand. These are our instructions. And as we consider Christ's presentation of the end that is then elaborated for us in Revelation, and that's why we've been making so much connections between the two. So this is the overview of the Olivet Discourse as it lines up. If you're frustrated with the chronology a little bit, I would tend towards Luke 21. But if you take those two or three informative verses out of Luke 21 and bring them back into Matthew 24, it helps you to recognize what is going on there. But remember, Jesus' presentation is more concerned about the disciples, that they be ready. They all want the kingdom to come. That's all they could think about. They wanted the kingdom, the kingdom, the kingdom, and they didn't. And Jesus says, you should be asking, what are we going to endure? And he says, I'm going to tell you what is not the kingdom coming. These are the things that are going on for a long period. These are the beginning of sorrows. This is the end is not yet. These are the things that are just going to be ongoing. And then in the midst of that, there is a big event in Jerusalem. But after that, there is going to the persecution is going to go away. The false Christs aren't going to go away. The other evidences of the church age aren't going to go away. In fact, at the very end, they will get very intense, and then the sign of the Son of Man comes. And so this is what we look for. We look for, and he uses the picture of the olive tree, that when you see the budding out, you know what's happening. You know spring is here. You know something's going on. And so you have those markers that give you some pretty advanced warning, and then you have a very, very quick warning right before Christ appears in the clouds, and we're gone. And so I'm looking forward to that. And so that's what I'm looking forward to, an intense time of persecution. You must be looking forward to that. Well, If it means the end is here and my escape is coming, my rescue is coming, my taking up out of this world is coming, yes, I'm looking forward to that. And then the sun and the moon darkening, stars falling from heaven, and then I will be just putting aside whatever's in my hand and having my gaze placed one place, and that is to the heavens, for there my Lord will come and to gather his elect. And I'll be listening for a trumpet after seeing the heavens in disarray, as described by Jesus and also by the sixth seal by John in Revelation 6. I hope this has helped, and I hope this satisfactorily addresses these two issues that were brought out. As I said, the other issues I dealt with last session. And again, as always, I do check these and I try to give written answers to questions and concerns that come up. There is one phrase that I didn't address in the Olivet Discourse, and that is the idea that this generation will not pass away till all is fulfilled. And that has been a concern for many people. Well, then, shouldn't the disciples have understood that to mean that um, that Christ should have come before they died? And of course, John addresses that because he was the last of the disciples to remain, and he tries to dispel that concept, and it's there in each place. Um, and the question is, surely I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away till all things take place. The question is, what is this generation? Please notice where that statement is made. It is not made after or immediately in conjunction with the other statements of the fall of Jerusalem. And I'm here in Luke 21 right now, so here it is, and it's after the sign of the coming of the Son of Man, and it's talking about that the kingdom of God is near when you see these things happening. Uh, and so this is our expectation that that generation who sees these intensities occurring will not pass away until all is fulfilled. Not the generation that who are the disciples, not the generation Jesus is talking to, but the generation who will see the intensification of persecution through all nations. And that's key. Frankly, in my country, we have been insulated from it, and many other Christian countries have been insulated from it. And we suddenly see that maybe we aren't so insulated from it, because here, even in this country, with all of our quote unquote liberties, our uh, governments have told us that we are no longer to be obedient to God's word in terms of meeting together and worship and all those things. We have to do it on the image, not in the person. And so suddenly we realize that, I hope, we realize that we are not uh, safe from the kind of persecution that Christ talks about at the end days that is so intense that it demands Christ's coming, that there might be some elect left. And so, whether we are of that number that are left to participate in the rapture, or whether we are of the number that will be hated and destroyed on this earth, looking forward to our place at the throne of God in heaven, let us stand fast. Let us be watchful. Let us take heed. Let us pray always that we will be expectant and not surprised, because we are all tied up into the things of this world. And this is the challenge of Jesus Christ to his disciples and to the disciples of all generations, and particularly to that generation, that you're the last one. Stand fast. If you're seeing this kind of thing happen throughout all the nations, not one nation, not just in Jerusalem, but everywhere, you know it's coming. You know it's coming near, at the door. The thief is at the door. And we're ready, I hope. And if you're not, I would suggest you go through our sessions again, because you should be ready. And we invite you to cast off the commitment to things of this world and set your heart on things above. For Jesus Christ is our inheritance, and it's to him we look. It's been a joy to do these sessions, and I pray that they are beneficial to you. We are going to be working through them and posting them in YouTube, edited and cleaned up a little bit from the live stream. And again, I'll be monitoring that and responding to comments and questions there as well. And we invite you to share these as well. And again, most all this material is derived from my book, Advancing the Watch, and I have that available. I can send you a copy free of charge, and I can do that. I have a large number of copies, and I'm more than happy to send that to anyone. Right now, shipping is pretty hard to do throughout the earth, and so electronically and audio, and that's why we made these sessions available to you. But we want to encourage you in that God has revealed Himself, not hidden. He's not hidden the future; He's revealed it. And as Daniel shares, the wise of the last generation will understand. This is God's promise, and that's my hope for you. And we're praying that God keeps you to that day and that you'll be faithful.